Modernization is a tale of drama. It arose as a result of insurrections or revolutions. Um, it was made possible by a coup d'etat, which we might be in the brink of. There's a lot of references in 19th century that we can still relate to today, like history repeats itself, right? There were immigrants coming in from the provinces, and they were marginalized and looked down upon and were underprivileged, like today. They were responsible for the demolition of building crews that were the foundation of the whole modernization process. And Haussmannization was also part of a financial scandal, what we might call Ponzi schemes today. So we have all the modern elements right here in the mid-19th century in France that we're still dealing with today. But I'm going to tell this through a visual history. And the first part is going to show you medieval to modern Paris, because behind the facades, in fact, you can still find medieval streets. So I'm sure you, being in Paris, you've all wandered to the older parts of the city and very narrow streets that are still in existence, despite what has become the emblem of Paris as being orderly and white facades and neoclassical architecture and so on. In part 3, I'm going to tell you the tale of Haussmannization as it was implemented under not only the city planner, but Emperor Napoleon III. And I'm going to tell you how Emperor Napoleon III became the emperor and had absolute power over remodeling, refurbishing, and modernizing Paris. And then the third part, I'm going to show you how modern art was inspired by Haussmannization. So like I said, I'm very visual and I have a lot of slides. And I hope you enjoy them. So the major players are Napoleon III, who you can see here in this portrait. And I'll tell you how he got that name, Napoleon III. And Haussmann, Georges-Eugène Haussmann, commonly known as Baron Haussmann. I'll tell you a little bit about how he became a baron, even though he was a commoner. I'll return to these slides in a bit. Haussmann's rise to power, and I'm sorry I didn't get this all put in here, was due to Napoleon III appointing him as the prefect of the Seine. That meant that he was the governor and city planner, designer of the region of Paris and its surroundings. Paris, remember, is the capital of France. It was the seat of the government too, following the revolution of 1789, when the king was beheaded and the seat of government was moved from Versailles to Paris. And Haussmann derived his title from Napoleon III, giving him the title of Baron, even though he was of common blood. Okay, so part 1 is medieval to modern Paris. And here you can see medieval people in their garb and the medieval city of Paris. It was very densely built within fortifications. The fortifications were built around the inner center, around the Ile de la Cité, which is where Notre Dame is, and I'll show you maps showing that. And then fortifications were built during the Renaissance, during the 16th and 17th century, and even into the 19th century. Since the early 20th century, the fortifications in the outer ring of Paris were torn down, and it's now an expressway. And we still call it the périphérique, the periphery. And so this is a painting by Edouard Manet called Music in the Tuileries, which I'll return to, of 1862. And you can see the modern dresses, the top hats and the black coats, very much the symbol of modern dress and fashion. And you can see the new boulevards, which I'm going to return to frequently, neatly laid out. I will even tell you that they were based on linear perspective, which we usually associate with painting and spatial depth. Haussmann designed the facades of these buildings so they would all line up in terms of the window alignments and the roof alignments to focus more often than not on major monuments at the end of a boulevard. So everything was a stage set for the drama of modern life to unfold. So here's medieval Paris. The map dates from the 16th century. Here's Notre Dame, and this is the Ile de la Cité. Okay, so I'm going to return to this frequently, but you can see there's very few bridges as opposed to the multiple bridges that we have today. And you can see that these are fortifications around here, but the original fortifications were around the Ile de la Cité and the right bank, where the Louvre now stands, and that will be right about here. The Louvre, I want you to know, was originally a medieval palace. It was then modernized in the 17th and 18th century, and it became a public museum after the revolution, because during the revolution of 1789, all of the all of the royal properties, as well as the church properties, became public property. And the royal collection housed at the Louvre became a public museum. But you can see very irregular streets, very densely built up. Now, this is the original fortifications, one of the original fortifications around Paris. And you can see that around Paris, outside of that fortification, it's very rural. It's very spread out, hillies and trees and farmland, okay? Now, this area in the outer ring is going to be incorporated by Haussmann and Napoleon III during the modernization of Paris. And that will mean the expansion of Paris, both in terms of land and population. So I'm going to refer back to these ideas as we move on. Now, this is a reconstruction of medieval Paris that's from a film, a 2009 film, which you can find online, but you have to have the stereoscopic glasses, or those cardboard glasses that you use when you were kids, to see the three-dimensional images that you look through a viewer. This film was made in that technological tradition. But anyway, you can see the very crowded buildings, and this is very typical, the half timber housing, very irregular. And then I'm going to show you later the area around the front of Notre Dame that we think of as, this open space, was very built up. It was housing and a commercial area. So again, this is that 1550, that 16th century map. Here's again Notre Dame. You can see it's all built up around here. And there were bridges connecting the Ile de la Cité to the left bank and to the right bank. But these bridges even had housing and commercial buildings and commercial activity on them. It's like in Venice when you go to that bridge with all the buildings. That's how it was. So this is a painting from the 18th century, but it shows still showing the houses that were on the bridges. This is the bridge between Notre Dame and let me see, the right bank. So here you can see, here's again Notre Dame in the background. So these were demolished during the early 19th century and extensively demolished during the Haussmannization period. Okay. So as a result of Paris becoming the seat of government, the population increased enormously. And as a result, there was overcrowding within the city center that caused diseases. There was no regulation on building. There was no sewage. There was crime. The streets were dark. Now you can see these lanterns here, and I'm fascinated by these lanterns because I work on this photographer, Charles Marville, who was commissioned to photograph the old Paris streets that were going to be torn down during Haussmannization and the new boulevards. So he's like one of my heroes of the period because he documents all the before and after and during. He also took photographs of demolition sites. So we have this whole range of photographs that kind of bring alive this experience of old Paris, demolition, and the rebuilding. But you can see these lanterns, and I want you to think about these lanterns. These were candle lanterns, so there had to be a lamplighter going down the streets and lighting these. Oil or candles. Wait, I'm sorry, these were oil lamps. These are oil lamps. And they became the symbol of insurrections because during the 1830 revolution and the 1848 revolution, the rebels smashed these lights so they could navigate the streets at night and build barricades. Barricades became the thorn in the rulers' sides because these narrow streets became the sites of insurrections, and the rebels built barricades out of trash furniture and even the stones in the pavement. They dug them up and they built barricades to prevent the royal troops from attacking them. Okay. Now, I'm going to tell you later that these oil lamps were replaced on the boulevards with gas lamps, which illuminated the city at night and was one means of preventing these rebellions. So in speaking to the overcrowded, the dark, the dangerous, the unhealthy Paris of these narrow, dark streets that were really characteristic of Paris before Haussmannization. A social reformer in 1849 wrote, "Paris is an immense workshop of putrefaction, where misery, pestilence, and sickness work in concert, where sunlight and air rarely penetrate. Paris is a terrible place where plants shrivel and perish, and where of 7 small infants, 4 died during the course of the year." We might even think that this is still the way of life and underprivilege of some of our urban ghettos in modern times. And I grew up in Detroit, and during the 1960s, there was a whole urban renewal project that demolished these urban centers and displaced the people living in unhealthy quarters. Where did they go? This is one of the problems. The workers from these areas, once their neighborhoods were demolished, really had nowhere to go except to that periphery where there wasn't even housing at the time. They often lived in caravans. So a lot of what's going on in the 19th century resonates today. Anyway, in these crowded conditions, disease spread very quickly. Cholera epidemics raged the city in 1832 and 1848. In the epidemic of 1848, 5% of the inhabitants of these neighborhoods that I'm showing you died. And history repeats itself, right? Where have we lost the most lives during our own pandemic? In overcrowded urban centers. Traffic circulation was another problem. The widest streets of these inner city neighborhoods around the Ile de la Cité, around the Notre Dame, were 16 feet wide, and the narrowest were 3 to 7 feet wide. Wagons and carriages could barely get through. So here's a wagon. It takes up half the width of the street, and this would be pulled by a horse. So you can imagine. I want you to notice the pavement here. It looks like it just rained, right? I'm going to show you some more of these streets. It looks like it just rained. All right. It looks like it just rained. I'm going to show you another one later. It's not rain. It's sewage. People would dump their sewage, whether it was from their kitchens or from their own personal refuse, out the windows. And these little inclines here, these were the drainage system that would then go into sewers that would empty into the Seine River. Now, all that's going to be corrected with Haussmannization. So these buildings would have been built randomly anywhere from the Middle Ages. You can see this one is kind of bowed outward because they could not take up more space on the ground, so they would extend them outward as they built up. And this building up of property was an organic process. It wasn't regulated. So with each generation, perhaps another story would be added. And here you can see the dimensions of these cities, of these streets, with the inhabitants in the streets. Again, not very wide. If he's taking up, a quarter of the width just by standing in the street, you can imagine how narrow they were. And again, here are their carts that they would carry down the street to sell their wares. So on the ground floors, we have the commercial entities, and then above we have the living quarters. And this is going to be the same formula that's followed in the new apartment buildings and commercial buildings at the ground story. Here again is one of those oil lamps that became a symbol of the rebels, smashing them so there would be no light during the evening, so they could assemble their barricades. And these would be the people who would be part of the rebellions, because the working class was very underprivileged, underpaid, had no decent living quarters or wages. And so I mentioned before that 1830 and 1848 were dates that were that had revolutions that followed the example of that first revolution of 1789 that established the Republic of France. Now, that Republic of France lasted only a few short years, because in 1899, Napoleon I, he wasn't Napoleon I, it was Napoleon Bonaparte, became what was called the First Consul. So he was like the prime minister. And 5 years after that, in 1804, he proclaimed himself emperor. So that's an absolutist government, right? A totalitarian government. And then he proceeded to conquer Western and Eastern Europe, as well as the African continent. Well, 1848 is the revolution that is our turning point for Haussmannization, for the modernization of Paris. Okay, it's not just political. It becomes an urban enterprise. It becomes a social and cultural enterprise that transforms the entire city, whether you're the working class, whether you're an artisan, whether you're a shopkeeper, whether you're bourgeoisie middle class, an attorney or a doctor, or even an and your ancestors were royalty, if you're in the aristocracy, everything is going to be transformed. So here's a scene of the Battle of the Soufflot barricades on Rue Soufflot on June 24th, 1848. And this is this would be a sketch. This would be based on eyewitness account, okay? And what do you have? You have the workers rising up. You have the military who is associated with the monarchy at this point, trying to overcome the rebels behind the barricades, okay? And here you can see one of the rebels picking up a cobblestone that's taken up from the street, the paving stones, and he's throwing it at the military in defense. And why is this called Soufflot? Because at the end of Rue Soufflot is a building that is now called the Pantheon or the Pantheon. It was originally built before the 1889 revolution in around 1750 by an architect whose name was Soufflot, and it was a church. It was a church of Saint Geneviève, the patron saint of Paris. So Rue Soufflot, the building that became, after the revolution, the Pantheon, where great thinkers of the French Republic and then monarchy again were buried, okay? Like Voltaire. Later, Madame Curie is buried here. We have all kinds of politicians and intellectuals, even artists and scientists are buried there. It's a pantheon. It's where the great people of the nation are built. So this becomes very symbolic to have a barricade here, right? And it's the common people against the military. Here we have an early photograph. Photography did not become a kind of a widespread technology until the 1850s. And even then it was just used for professional purposes. Here we have a very early photograph of a barricade of 1848. And then another scene of the fallen victims, whether they're military or commoners. Victor Hugo recorded his impression. In less than an hour, 27 barricades rose from the ground in the single quarter of the markets. The narrow, uneven, sinuous streets full of turns and corners were admirably chosen. The environs of the markets in particular, a network of streets that were more intricate than a forest. So he's referring to those winding streets that I showed you in the map that are still medieval. So one of the reasons that is often told that Napoleon III demolished medieval Paris was to prevent these barricades in the narrow streets. But that's just one of the reasons for the boulevards as we know them today. Those wide, beautiful, linear, precision boulevards that are so easy to navigate, whether you're driving or you're in a bus or you're in a subway system or walking. You know where you're headed just because of the precision and the rationalism that's behind the planning of those intersecting wide boulevards. Now, what was the outcome of the revolution? Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the nephew of Napoleon I, comes to power and begins the rebuilding of Paris. Now, in December 1848, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte won the first presidential election ever held in Paris. And that meant that everybody who had permission to vote, and this was mostly landed people, voted by a percentage of 76%. 4.2% of the electorate who were allowed to vote. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was elected largely because of his name, because after the revolution, people wanted someone to lead Paris back, or wanted to lead France back to its glory. The king that was deposed, his name was Louis Philippe. And he was, I hope I don't offend anybody, but he was like a Donald Trump. He was there for the very wealthy landowners and entrepreneurs. Their hands were in his pockets, and he gladly gave them money. He gladly financed all of his cronies. Okay. And so, of course, the working class and the intellectuals were very much against this kind of monarchy and power that he had. So Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, that is the nephew of Napoleon, while he was president, promised to end poverty and improve the lives of ordinary people. So he became a kind of a populist president, again, like we have today. In 1852, now this is right before he becomes an emperor, he says, Paris is the heart of France. Let us apply our efforts to embellishing this great city. Let us open new streets, make the working class quarters, which lack air and light, more healthy, and let the beneficial sunlight reach everywhere within our walls. And he's not talking about the Mexican wall. He's talking about those fortifications. Okay. And let's illuminate these spaces. Let's illuminate and make these spaces healthier for our working classes. And in fact, one of Louis Napoleon's first projects was to design and build a working quarter for working class with healthy buildings and amenities. With more air and light. Of course, this is only a small part of Paris, but his intentions were good. The story unfolds when Louis Napoleon, becomes emperor. And by the end of his reign, he too is privileging the entrepreneur, the real estate barons, the railroad barons, everybody who has their hands in the treasury. And Haussmann, his city planner, becomes the target of attacks. But this is a later story. As president, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte introduced urban renewal solutions, which continued into his imperial reign. Widen the boulevards. Now, the wide boulevard subverts the building of barricades, but it also has other benefits. What? Light and air that pours into the new buildings. It provides better transportation. It allows for the ease of traffic and commercial trade. Remember those narrow streets that you hardly could get a wagon through. He installs a unified sewage system. He installs a unified underground gas lines, which allow for street lights to be installed throughout the city, allows for interior lighting in these new apartment buildings, and allows for heating and cooking in these interiors. He installs a public park system throughout the city, not only grand, spectacular parks, but neighborhood parks, small squares. And if you roam the streets of Paris, you know that every so often, every few blocks, you come to a new little park. That was part of Napoleon III's plan. One of his first projects was to complete the project of his uncle, Napoleon I. And that takes the shape of the Rue de Rivoli in Paris. You remember the Rue de Rivoli? You have those arcades with all the shops. And on one side is this continuous, you can see these continuous roof lines, continuous balconies, continuous attic storylines, continuous arcades. This became the blueprint for every other boulevard designed under Haussmann and Napoleon III. Now, remember, you have the shops on this side, and it's tree lined on the other side. What's behind the tree lined sidewalks? The tree lining is another part of the grand plan to create green spaces, to create healthy air, because trees, of course, emit oxygen, and this is part of our way of creating healthy environments today. We're replanting trees that were torn down during urban renewal. Well, this was a part of Haussmann and Napoleon's plan to bring trees into the city center. On the other side is the Tuileries Gardens, that great park that was named after the palace that once stood in the Tuileries Gardens, called the Tuileries Palace. And right over here, you're going to have the Louvre, that medieval palace that was modernized in the 18th century and then became the public museum that we know today. At the end of this boulevard, you see the Arc de Triomphe, which was also a Napoleon I creation. But this Rue de Rivoli somehow aligns, as does the Tuileries Gardens, with the Arc de Triomphe. That becomes a major focal point for the boulevards to align with. So remember I said these new boulevards aligned with major monuments, so that at the end of a vista, at the end of this kind of merging of the sides of the streets, you're going to have this grandiose monument. And another project was to modernize, expand the Bois de Boulogne, which was a royal hunting ground. Today, it is this miraculous, romantic, charming park, which is actually kind of next to the Arc de Triomphe at the end of that boulevard. It's on the northwest quadrant of the city. And he expanded the park with his park designers, making fountains and lakes and these serpentine roads, and carving a racetrack in here. Very famous, Longchamp is the racetrack, and many other amenities, so that it became a public park that Parisians could have access to without leaving the city. They could be in the countryside. See this border here? This is still the 1879, still in 1879, the fortification walls, which again are called the Périphérique, now a major highway surrounding the city. Okay, here's when all the action starts to take place. December 2nd, 1851, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte stages a coup d'etat, which we might have in our own time. Aren't you excited? All right. Well, he was denied the presidency for a second term. So he got the army on his side. He says, I'm not leaving this presidential palace. I'm going to stay here. And so he launched a coup d'etat, and he became he became the president for another year, until on the same date, 1 year later, he announces that he is going to be the emperor. He becomes the emperor, Napoleon III, because there was a Napoleon II who was Napoleon's son who died. So anyway, he becomes Napoleon III. Now France is ruled under the heading of the Second Empire. Now, December 2nd is important because that was the date of a Napoleonic victory, and also the date that Napoleon made himself Emperor Napoleon I, 50 years earlier. So now part 2, Haussmannization and the rapid transformation of Paris. So it was pretty traumatic for about, from 1853, when Haussmann was made the prefect of Paris, of the Seine, sorry, that is the region of Paris and around it. Every day, on every corner, every day of your life, you're like confronted with demolition sites. Imagine how noisy it is, okay? You had steam-powered demolition balls, okay? But most of it was done with pickaxes and drills, steam-powered drills. It's noisy, it's dusty. You don't know when your own home's going to be demolished, but this is the outcome, okay? This is one of the demolition sites. You can see just buildings stripped away, holes in the ground. Why are the holes in the ground? Well, first of all, you have to build new foundations for these. Now you're going to have like 6 or 7 story buildings that you didn't have before. And they're all built on a combination of iron and masonry, skeletons, interior skeletons. But we're also in the era of installing the underground gas lines and sewage systems, okay? So there are a lot of pits. These became public spectacles, but also sites of misery. So here on June 22nd, 1853, Napoleon appoints Haussmann to the prefect of the Seine. Here's a portrait of Baron Haussmann. You remember the name was given to him as an honorary title. And here's a later portrait, actually a kind of a historical scene where Napoleon III hands to Haussmann the decree annexing the Parisian suburbs to Paris. This took place around 1860. Remember I said that region outside of the fortifications that was rural? Those were added on to Paris in 1860. And I'm going to explain that a little bit further. But when all these buildings are being demolished, when these medieval quarters were being demolished, where the artisans and the laborers worked, they were assigned to the periphery. And gradually the periphery was built up. And even now today, that's where most of the working class works. And the immigrants of Paris have settled. That's where a lot of the social unrest is generated from, those areas today. So this map is this kind of schematic map I wanted to show you, and I'm going to show it to you again, that shows the major boulevards. I don't want that. And the major boulevards, along with ancillary streets that created those axes that opened up to major monuments, but also facilitated and eased the flow of traffic through Paris. It's, you know, it's like a lot of traffic today, but you can imagine with all those narrow streets that traffic was really congested. These wide boulevards facilitated the flow of traffic, because now it's not only the seat of government, but the seat of commerce and trade and international finances and everything that we know of Paris today. So these are the major boulevards that cut through Paris. And Napoleon III installed a huge map of Paris in his office, marked with colored lines where he wanted the new boulevards to be. He and Haussmann met almost every day to discuss the projects and had to overcome enormous obstacles and opposition as they built the new Paris. Now, the legend has it, and I'll show you a map that was made by Haussmann, that Haussmann and Napoleon looked at these maps maybe on the wall or spread out on a table. In fact, FSU has one of those original maps that I found in Paris, and the FSU library purchased it under my advice. Anyway, I'd love to show it to you. Anyway, and they took their rulers and their compasses and their, their geometric line tools and all that. And they just like slashed through these neighborhoods. Okay, regardless of who lived there or what, just to make these alignments and to widen the streets and to build those new buildings. And so Rue de Rivoli, as I said, was the model for, and here's the Rue de Rivoli here, was the model for building all the following boulevards. And the first phase of this renovation was called Le Grand Croisset de Paris, or the Great Cross in the center of Paris. And you can see here, right here and here, this was the first phase. And then it expanded to these outer boulevards. Yeah, so the Rue de Rivoli was part of that original plan. An east-west boulevard and a north-south boulevard. This is the right bank, this is the left bank, this is the Ile de la Cité, where the Notre Dame is, and those boulevards and bridges cut through the Ile de la Cité, through those medieval streets. And you can see the more bridges now in modern Paris than those two bridges on either side that we saw in medieval Paris. So let's just look briefly at Notre Dame Cathedral and the square in front of it. And by the way, when that steeple burned and caused the conflation of the roof, the steeple was actually a 19th century addition. It was lead. It wasn't part of the original church. And that lead, that molten lead, is what kind of caused the conflation of the wooden roof, really, because once it fell, it was like there was no chance of ever stopping that fire. So here's a square in front of Notre Dame as we know it today. And you can see from the Seine River on the opposite side, there's no buildings. Well, during the medieval period and even into the 16th, 17th century, it was all built up around Notre Dame. There was even a hospital on either side of the building. These were all demolished to open up that space and make Notre Dame a monument for the city, right? It's another kind of a stage set. It's a mark of pride and great engineering feat of the medieval period. And so the French people want to display this in all of its glory. So that's one of the reasons that square was opened up and buildings demolished. Now, if you visited Notre Dame, have you been on a tour of the cathedral? So you know what it looks like inside. It remains medieval intact. Have you been to the crypt below Notre Dame? Well, in the 1960s, when this area was threatened by another urban renewal scheme, they were excavating the site to build a parking lot, underground parking lot, okay? And while they were excavating, they came upon the ruins of the ancient Roman city that was first Lutece, that was the Roman city, from, I would say before the 1st century BC. And built on top of that was the medieval city. So all of those streets and building remains were intact under Notre Dame. And you can now visit this as an archaeological site. It's called the Crypt of Notre Dame, and it's on this end of the plaza. You have to go underground to get there, but it's fascinating. It's just fascinating. And then if you walk along the pavement here, you'll see the markings of the medieval streets in the pavement. Okay. And another point of interest is what should I say, kind of a solar map, where it's like kind of a map, it's a disc. It's the center point of France and Paris, from which all roads lead out of Paris to all of the provinces of France. So this really is the heart and the center of Paris and France, literally. So here again is the Notre Dame and all the buildings around it, and this was all cleaned out. The new buildings became the General Hospital, the Supreme Court, if you will, and the headquarters of the police, of the National Police. So all this was cleared away. Boulevards were built through. The area around Notre Dame was cleaned out, and the space in front of it. Okay, so here's again, medieval Paris, the fortifications. You can see the rural areas outside of the fortifications. And again, in 1860, this interior layout of Paris, which you can still see the kind of zigzag shapes of old fortification walls, was expanded to include 8 additional districts. We call these districts arrondissements. And there were originally 12. Here's Notre Dame again, that kind of flowed outward, because this is the original Paris. Then Paris got bigger, and then even bigger. And these are the fortifications built in the 19th century. But so there were 12 original districts, and then 8 additional added. Okay. And again, this is where the working class population expanded to, and was built up as Paris grew exponentially as the capital and the seat of commerce and government. And this is where the Bois de Boulogne is, on this end. And let me line you up with, this is the Louvre here, and this is going to be the Arc de Triomphe. And I'm just showing you this because this shows you the green spaces that were implemented throughout Paris. These are the larger ones, not so much the neighborhood ones, but you can see the new boulevards and the park system. Now, on one end is the Bois de Boulogne. Here, another park, not as famous, it's called Vincennes. This is the site of another medieval fortification and palace. So at either end of the east-west, you have huge parks, and then dispersed all through Paris. This is the Tuileries Gardens, and this is the Luxembourg Gardens, if you're familiar with them. So he not only implemented a park system of new parks, but refurbished old parks. So there was, like I said, there was trauma of demolition and reconstruction of Paris. And one of the aspects is that Paris was now invaded by these other elements who are the other elements? They were workers, they were masons, they were demolishers, came with the pickaxes and carts, and droves of immigrants from the provinces. And these people were thought of as outsiders. They spoke a different kind of language, a different dialect. They dressed different. They were rough. They were crude. They were not civilized Parisians. And if you've been to Paris, there's still this snobbiness. There's like, so if you don't greet the lady of the shop, like, bonjour, mademoiselle, they won't even look at you. And it's like, you have to have a certain manner, a certain je ne sais quoi, right? To be treated as an equal. I know when I try with my very rough French to speak French, I know that I endear them and they start to speak to me in English, especially the younger generation. I'm going to give you a footnote here, just because as a teacher, I always give my students footnotes. So I had a grant to what should I say, do research for my dissertation in the late 1960s. Oh, no, wait. No, it was in the 1970s. Sorry. When did I get my dissertation? Oh, no. Okay. It was like in the late 1970s. Sorry. I forget. Late 1970s. And so that allowed me to go to Paris to do research. And I lived in a great, elegant area near the Eiffel Tower because of my boyfriend at the time had an exchange student, and he had a girlfriend whose parents owned a bakery near the Eiffel Tower, and they owned property, and I was able to live in their apartment. Anyway, so I'm walking across the Champ de Mars because I'm going to the Louvre, and it's like one of my first days there. And I stop a young woman with her elderly mother, and I say, "Où est le musée?" or something like that. And the young woman answers me, and the older lady goes, "Pardon, pardon, pardon." She would not talk to me because I didn't say, "Excusez-moi, mademoiselle," or "Madame, où est le Louvre?" Like that. She was like, and the daughter's going, mom, just okay. So, but it still exists today. So here are the workers coming in, and they were like criminalized, they were underprivileged, they were ostracized, and they were made fun of all the time. Now, this is Paris. Paris is the allegorical woman, and she's wearing a belt. This is the fortification, and they're breaking through the belt. And here's Paris, and they're going to demolish Paris and rebuild it. So this is a caricature. Here's one of those maps that Haussmann drew up, where these are buildings in these odd streets, and he's just going to take his ruler and what do you use for, not a compass? What's the other tool you use? This is like half moon shape. What is that called? You know that instrument though, right? So they're taking this all through and just slashing through. What is it called?
Protractor. Protractor.
Yeah. And they're just slashing through. It doesn't matter. So these are the buildings that are being demolished, the streets and all that. That was what I want to show you. So here again, we have the demolition of an area that was demolished to align the new opera building with the Louvre. So this is one of the demolition scene. Here's another one. So like I said, every twist and turn you're facing, but this is again the results. Remember this one isn't all built up yet, but in this one you can see the uniform balcony lines, attic story, upper stories. And now I want to show you something else. On the ground stories, we still have those commercial entities, and then in the mezzanine area, you'll have offices, but above you'll have living quarters. And one of the new features of these new commercial properties is plate glass windows. Plate glass is a sheet of glass, uniform, that you don't need the grids in between. And that was an invention of the Industrial Revolution. So now all of the Paris streets are lined with plate glass windows that you can, do window shopping, and now there's a whole industry of window display and so on and so forth. So that's the Paris we know today. And then these news spiral stands, a cylinder, what do they call,
Kiosks.
Kiosks. They're being removed as we speak. But they were a way to advertise theater and publications and whatever you have. Even the old newspaper kiosks are being demolished under the current mayor of Paris, because I don't know why. So here's some funny caricatures showing at last the sun will shine on my potted plants. Remember, one of the critics says, you can't even grow plants in Paris. Well, now he's so happy he wakes up one morning and his plant can finally grow, and he'll know whether it's a weed or a rose bush. Well, he's next, because here are the crews with their demolition pickaxes and ladders. He's next to go. That's how fast it was. And Haussmann became the target for the drama and the criticism of using up public funds for the advantage of the wealthy landowners and pushing out the commoners to either more high rent domiciles or out of the city completely. And this is on moving day. Here are the moving wagons, and here's mother, father, kid, and their bird. And here is a landlord. I don't care. I don't care if it's being demolished, because I own this property and I'm going to build a new apartment building when I'm going to raise the rents, and you won't even be able to afford to live here anymore. So again, urban renewal schemes that persisted into the 20th century and today. So this was his falling, because I want to read to you how this was all financed. And I'm going to read to you. Under the emperor, Haussmann had greater power than any of his predecessors of the prefects. And the French Senate had gained control during the years of Napoleon III's emperorship, I could say. And the French Parliament controlled also the monetary funds. And this was with Napoleon III at the helm. The French Parliament provided 50 million francs, but that was not nearly enough to realize the renovation projects that Napoleon III and Haussmann had planned. So Napoleon III appealed to the Perrier brothers, Emile and Isaac, two bankers who had created a new investment bank called the Crédit Mobilier, the kind of, if you will, mobile credit. The Perrier brothers organized a new company which raised 24 million francs to finance the construction of a specific street, in this case, in exchange for the rights to develop real estate along that route. This became a model for the building of all of Haussmann's future boulevards. Now, that meant that they were selling bonds to develop real estate. And then the people who owned those real estate were selling real estate that didn't even exist, because then they were selling rights to build on that property as you went higher and higher up. And each person that owned the real estate plot increased the rent as they built up. So this was like a Ponzi scheme, because you're also selling like fake property that doesn't exist. So that became the norm. So Haussmann was forced to resign. He because he wouldn't, I mean, he was asked to resign. He wouldn't resign, so he was fired in 1870. And then Napoleon III was defeated because of the Franco-Prussian War, which France lost in 1871. But that's another story. So now I'm going to briefly take you through the art, the modern art that was inspired by Haussmannization. The first artist, and I'm going to bring in Kai Bott a lot, because he was kind of a navigator of these boulevards. He came from a very wealthy family, and he lived in one of the new Haussmann buildings. So he has these eyewitness accounts. But I show you Paris Street Rainy Day, which is actually at the Art Institute of Chicago now. And this is actually a rainy pavement. It's not sewage. Here is those perfectly geometricized building blocks of commercial on the ground stories and building living quarters above that have these axial intersecting boulevards, and the street lamps. The modern street lamps now are gas lit. So the gas comes up from the underground gas lines and illuminates the lights, and you don't have to have lamplighters going around any longer. They're set automatically. And here we have the very fashionable Parisians with the top hat and overcoat, and this woman, of course, wearing her overcoat and hat. And the umbrella was also was a modern invention as well. The springs open was a modern invention. You can see here now a carriage, a passenger carriage, has a lot of space. People can walk the pavement and not get soot and excrement on them, whether it's human or horse excrement, and the shop fronts as well. So this is a very dynamic painting, because you can see you can go like down either side of the boulevard, and you have a couple coming forward, and you have couples crossing the street, and it's like this is like you're just walking into everyday Paris in the 19th century. I love it because it's so immediate. We might even identify with this figure right here. And even the Impressionists painted the modern city. So here we have Renoir painting the Pont Neuf. The Pont Neuf connected the right bank to the Ile de la Cité, and it was built up with those houses, right? But during Haussmannization, those houses were torn down. You have little seating areas here, and you have the gas light, street lights, and people just navigating the roads freely and brilliantly lit day. And where is Renoir painting this from? Probably from one of the new Haussmann buildings, because he's elevated, right? So he's not on the ground story. He's looking from above down. So he had the privilege of maybe someone's apartment, because he wasn't very rich at this point, but he's certainly in a privileged position looking down at the street. And here we have women in their fancy dresses, and we have nannies with their charges, and we have dogs. And again, we're just free floating in this wonderful new environment. And I want to tell you also that the stone that was used to face these new buildings was quarried from underground Paris, and it's a yellow-white stone, and so it was like a wedding cake. It wasn't dirty with smog and soot and all that. So in the sunlight, because of the crystallization of these stones, it would kind of sparkle. So this was like a wedding cake, really, or a jeweled queen, as one of the contemporaries said. And here are scenes from the newly remodeled Bois de Boulogne, both of these. And here Manet takes the opportunity to paint his friends and himself, here's Manet here, in the Tuileries Gardens, which were the extension from the Louvre to the Tuileries Palace, all the way up to the end of the Rue de Rivoli, the Tuileries Gardens were refurbished. They're listening to music. Where is the music? Well, if you've been in the gardens in Paris, you have these pavilions in the middle of the garden, and that's where the bands play. Sometimes you can catch a band playing. Other times you'll see brides having their photos taken. The Asian brides love to have their photos taken around Paris, and they are just beautiful. They are just beautiful specimens of perfection. But often you'll see them around Paris. Anyway, so they're intermingling again, all the modern clothing and bonnets, and she's wearing a veil because veils became a necessity with the dust around and all that. Children playing, and just the delight of the being in a park and having this fresh air in the middle of the city is what's being spoken to here. And then the city becomes very animated and fragmented just because of the fragmentation of the bulldozing and demolition sites, but also the modern movement. There's more people, there's more carriages, there's more modes of transportation. And this is an interesting view of the Place de la Concorde, which is at the center of Paris, at the end of the Tuileries Gardens. This is Monsieur Lepec with his daughters, and they're both pointed. The daughters are all engaged with different things going on. You have to imagine the sound, right, of the horses going over the pavement and the click clack and people walking and talking, and he's headed one way and the girls are looking another way, and there's like it's a fragmented experience, right? Their bodies are even cut off. This is just like a glimpse of all this dynamism that's happening now in the new city. So it's interesting that the artists we think of as the modern artists, Edouard Manet, Edgar Degas, the Impressionists, Monet, and Renoir, Caillebotte, they don't paint demolished Paris. They don't paint old Paris. They paint modern Paris. Okay, this was their opportunity to announce the new era. And I just brought this in to show you where they're standing. They're standing right here because you can see that little, that's like a guard's gate. And this is the Place de la Concorde. And the Place de la Concorde lines up with the Arc de Triomphe that I mentioned earlier. And so there's the Tuileries Gardens. The palace would be here and the Louvre behind that. And here I want to show you that even along the boulevards, as I said, the green spaces were really important. Here, I love this photo because not only do you have a partially paved road, the pavers haven't finished here, but you have the workers bringing in trees from the countryside to plant along the boulevards. Each tree was planted as in a specified distance from each other so that you have a grid throughout the city, not only for the buildings, but for the trees. That's how geometric and organized this plan is. And you can see the trees here lining the boulevard. The sewers and gas lines. This is a cutaway. So this would be the sewage, and these would be the gas lines. Here's another cutaway from this area here. And this was all unified. You had sporadic installation of sewage systems, but not gas lines. So this is all, it's an underground city, if you will, by itself. And it was so popular that people took tours of the sewer system, which you can still do today. It doesn't smell bad. They kind of clean up. And in the underground sewage system, they have street signs so you know where you are in the streets. And Victor Hugo described this in Les Miserables. Paris has another Paris under itself, a Paris of sewers, which has its streets, its crossings, its squares, its blind alleys, its arteries, and its circulation, which is slime minus the human form. But he wasn't thinking about the tourists under here. They had floodlights to illuminate where they were going. But you'll remember that Jean Valjean has to escape through the sewers. And what we call street furniture, these very elegant street, going from very fashionable, elegant, ornate on the boulevards to the more utilitarian gas street lights. This was in front of the markets, the central markets, and this is on the Boulevard Haussmann, named after Haussmann, which is near the Opera, which is very elegant area. Okay, so street lights are shown very prominently in this this pastel, sorry, by Degas, Women on the Cafe Terrace at Night of 1877. These women are actually prostitutes. This is a symbol, if you will. And here we have a male potential patron. But what he's celebrating too is the illumination of the boulevards at night, right? Where the women can sit on the street. They don't have to just walk in dark corners of the street. They can actually advertise their goods in the gaslight. And we have the reflection of those lights in those shop front windows. And you can see the people crowding the boulevard sidewalk. So this is just, and here inside, they're actually in the terrace of a cafe. And you know, when you walk down the boulevards of Paris, maybe in the winter or at night, you have those open terraces in front of, and that's where they're sitting. So that means that the light is also coming in from inside the cafe, because now the cafe can be illuminated at night with gaslight. So you have two sources of light. Very exciting time. And then his Degas' portrayals of stage performance, what he's celebrating is not only the performers, but the light coming up from below the stage. Here again, gaslight. So that's why the tutus are illuminated and their legs are illuminated from below, their faces from below, right? This was a popular cafe concert, and these are two dancers at the Paris Opera. Okay, so I'm almost finished with the railways. So Napoleon III built 2 new railway stations, but also embellished the existing ones to make the railway stations entry and exit gates in a very monumental fashion. So we have and the railway was introduced in the 1840s to Paris, but very few. Now, in the second half of the 19th century, they're situated around Paris so that every point, north, northwest, northeast, south, southeast, has its own line. Okay, and the Gare Saint-Lazare is a very famous one because Monet painted it, and because the Impressionist painters took this train to take day trips or weekend trips along the Seine River as it wound itself into the rural areas that they painted along the Seine River in the Impressionist style. So it's a very famous site. Here's an example of one of the embellishments of a railway station. This is the utilitarian side, but this is the city public side. And so they were designed after the Roman baths and Roman Forum. These are imperial landmarks, okay? This is announcing Paris as a gateway to civilization, whether you're coming or going. And here is Manet's famous painting of the railway. And this is the Gare Saint-Lazare, built again during Haussmannization. You can see how ornate it is. It's like a grand palace. The new railway stations had not only the railway administration in them, but also hotels built above them. And this is me in an earlier iteration of myself, looking at the station of the railway tracks of the Gare Saint-Lazare. Now, what's shown here are the railway tracks, not the railway station. And again, it's the noise, it's the smell that we're experiencing here with Manet, because this is a nanny with her charge, and she has a little puppy who's sleeping on her, but she's reading, and all of a sudden she hears something or somebody going by. The little girl is immersed in the train action and the steam that's coming from, and the steam is also associated with the ringing of the train bell, and it's letting out steam at the same time. So there's a noise of the steam, there's a smell, there's a dynamic motion of the train coming through, and that's what the little girl is immersed in. And interestingly enough, the artists like Manet and Monet took up residency in this area of the Gare Saint-Lazare. Here is Monet's painting of the Gare Saint-Lazare. Not the station itself, but the steel and glass canopy that covers the rails entering the station. And why? Because that glass filters the sunlight and breaks it down into its compositional colors of red, yellow, and blue, and dissolves by sunlight and atmosphere everything that appears to be tangible and concrete. And the steam coming off of the engine exaggerates that dissolution of stone, steel, glass, the atmosphere around you. And what I love especially is that Monet recognized the brilliant new stonework of these Haussmann buildings behind the station. Here's the same view. This is the Pont de l'Europe, the bridge that is built over the train tracks of the Gare Saint-Lazare, the railway station. And this is by Caillebotte. And again, he gives us a view of people coming forward, a dog going backward. Here's a workman. Here are two kind of bourgeois people, but it's just a slice of life. And you're hearing the trains as they go under. Here is, again, that steam from the train passing under the bridge. So you have to imagine the smells, the sounds, the movements when you're looking at these paintings. Now, I want to take you to the apartment buildings, which I mentioned before, had the commercial enterprises on the first story and mezzanine, and above we have the residences. Now you might notice that the very tall windows are at the, what we would call the third floor. It's the second floor, or the first floor in European terms, are taller than the floors above. And I'm going to tell you why that is. Again, here's the commercial floors. Here's the first floor, second floor, third floor, fourth floor, attic story. Anybody, you see the balconies that you can actually walk on to with these first two stories. But here is not so much a balcony, it's just like you can stick your neck out. This is because the most wealthy people lived in these, I'm sorry, that's the mezzanine. These stories, the first living quarters, very tall windows. You can open the windows, the door windows, to allow light and air, and the kind of middle class. And then as you go further up, the less wealthy classes. And then under the eaves, you had the servants and the students and the poor artists. And this kind of illustrates that in a kind of a funny way here, the workers, and then the bourgeois and the family where their income is less, and then the working classes and the impoverished artist here. But this is a good scheme showing you the different levels. And I want to show you then a painting that takes place on one of these balconies, probably a balcony about here or here, because we have one of those wide open double doors, what we call French doors, right? Opening up to a balcony that you can actually sit on. As you got further up, you can't really sit on those balconies. I don't know if you ever rented an apartment in Paris, but you're probably up here, because nowadays you can't afford to rent even by the week or the month. I always stay up here. And I've even stayed up here. So here they are looking down. Again, Manet shows his brother, his future sister-in-law, who's also an artist and a violinist. She's either coming or going. Eva Gonzalez is staring down at the boulevard. Their dog is looking in a different direction. We don't know what he's doing. There's a young boy here holding an urn. This is life inside the apartment, and that kind of intermediate space where you still have the privacy of your apartment, but you can also take part in the action of the boulevard. And the light is what counts here, because now those boulevards just shed light on those brilliant white surfaces and on the people who are privileged enough to occupy those balconies and allow the light to come in. And here you can see another bourgeois couple. He's reading by the sunlight. He's reading the newspaper while she's gazing on the street. Here again, another balcony with a worker and a bourgeois man. Caillebotte actually lived in this apartment. So again, we have that firsthand view, and they're looking down at the boulevard, but remember those boulevards are tree lined. Okay. So we have green spaces, and we have that those brilliant white new stone facades that are part of the spectacle of modern Paris. Oh, another kind of furniture that we find are the pissoirs. So you know what they are, right? And this was a sanitation measure that was part of the Haussmann scheme, so that men wouldn't pee on the sides of buildings and in alleyways. Now actually they had modern ones, which are really gross, but you also have pay for use toilets on the streets. Yeah, anyway, but men still have the habit of peeing on walls and on the street in Paris. Sometimes you can smell this. Anyway, architecture. I'm going back to architecture, and this was the kind of the jewel on the crown for Napoleon III and Haussmann. This is the Paris Opera, now called the Palais Garnier, because the architect name was Garnier. And when asked what style this was, even though it is very much styled on Versailles in the Baroque era of the 17th century, Garnier replied, "It's Napoleon III style. It's the imperial style. Very ornate, but this was a palace for the people." This was the original opera building that was not the original, but it was of the Haussmann era. And it was supposed to be accessible from the boulevard, but also for the privilege with season tickets. You could walk in, but you could be dropped off by your car, by your carriage. And on the other side was the emperor's entrance. So this was supposed to be a democratized palace that made the opera available to everyone. And this at the time was the largest theater in the world. And Camille Pissarro, another impressionist of Paris, celebrates this new boulevard that aligns with the Louvre on this side and the Tuileries Gardens to focus on the opera building itself. You'll notice that this is 1898. The buildings are still shimmering in this golden white hue. This is Napoleon III and his wife, the Empress, visiting the construction site, and they're on the side of the emperor's entrance as it would finally be built right here. And here's the demolition view to align that vista from the top of the opera all the way down to the Louvre and the Tuileries Gardens. And here are the Haussmann buildings. And I want you to notice the interior courts. They weren't blocks. They had interior courts to allow sun and light and air to filter through the backsides of the apartments and from the front. So there was circulation in these new modern buildings. And here again, you can see that alignment is just perfect. And then you can see the interior courts as well. And let me see. So here's the Louvre. Okay. And Notre Dame is here, I believe. All right. And here's modern, well, not modern, but late 19th and early 20th century views that you're more familiar with. And the ballet dancers would have rehearsal rooms in the new building with the very tall windows, allowing the light to come in, and they wouldn't have to depend on artificial lighting. And they could open the windows to allow circulation of air. And I just love these because you can still see the new buildings and the tree-lined boulevards. And this is so much a part of modern Paris. And you'll notice how young these dancers are. And that's because families would bring their young daughters to Paris to become ballet dancers at the opera. And that's how they made money. And the not just from dancing, but because they became the mistresses of the bourgeois and elite male population of Paris. And that's what drove the economy. And I could speak volumes about that. Anyway, I'm going to end with this. This is perhaps one of my favorite paintings. And it's because it evokes Paris, even though it's inside, it's modern Paris. This is one of the famous cabaret bars. Cabarets were places of entertainment and social mingling of all classes could mingle here and serve food and alcohol. And this is in the main performance or auditorium room, and the back walls were actually curved. So indeed, and they were lined with mirrors. So indeed, this is the same barmaid, although she has a kind of a different attitude as she's approaching her client who's come to order his drinks. But in the mirror reflection, you can see the people looking at each other or watching the performance of trapeze artists or mingling on the ground story because there's a balcony. And we have the gas lighting and we have the gaslit chandelier, and everything is shimmering, sparkling and dissolving, except for this woman who's the barmaid. And why does she look so disengaged? Because she's one of these young women who have come to Paris from the provinces, because the provinces are being eaten up alive. The capital depends on the provinces for the agriculture and the masonry workers and all that, but they aren't being supported. So a lot of the provincial people come to the city to get work, and she's alienated. She's wearing kind of a ready-made, ready-to-wear dress, which the new department stores are now allowing the working class to have access to, but she's alone in this environment. She's not part of the crowd. She's separate from it, and she's kind of in her own kind of self-contemplation. And on this side, she might even be solicited by her man who comes up to order drinks, because waitresses were in a very vulnerable situation, like the laundresses, like the ballerina dancers, because they were single women in a space where they weren't chaperoned as decent women were, or they didn't have a male companion. They were alone and they were targets for prostitution. So we don't know if she gives in. She's in a liminal space. She's like this in-between space, just as all of Paris was during a time of Haussmannization. And thank you. And I'm sorry to go over, but if you have a question, I'm here. I'm yours for as long as you need me.
Lauren, why don't you unshare your screen? And there are some questions in this chat room.
Hi. So listen, if any of you want to organize a tour to Paris, I want to be your leader. If anybody has other organizations they belong to, I am willing to lecture on anything in the modern period. I can even do literature. I am retiring at the end of this semester, so I'm a free agent. I'm a free agent, and I'm going to do gigs. I'm going to finish writing my book, but I'm going to do gigs.
Okay.
I am freelancing.
Okie doke. Tony, David. Unmute yourself.
I hope I can answer your questions.
I was there years ago and did a tour of Notre Dame. In fact, also went to an organ recital in Notre Dame, and was wonderful in Notre Dame because you could walk around in the staircases and see all the gargoyles and everything and really get into it. My wife, Tony, and I went back in June of 2019, and we went 2 weeks after Notre Dame had burned down. So
were you
get to see Notre Dame? But I was wondering, any idea how the renovations of Notre Dame are proceeding and how the pandemic has affected that?
The renovations are proceeding. They just took down the scaffolding. I've been watching it. They're taking down the scaffolding, so that means that the masonry is stable enough for them to continue with the renovations. So there's progress being made. What was your other question?
Well, how has
the pandemic hasn't influenced it because they don't have people coming in and out, and they're wearing protective gear anyway, the people working on site. So they were wearing masks, but they have to wear it because of the
French poodle. The French poodle, right?
No, she's a Jack Russell. I'm sorry, just a second, okay, just a second.
It sure has made me want to go back to Paris.
My house is undergoing Haussmannization. My painter's here. What I was going to say is they have to wear protective gear because of the ash and the pollutants from the fire. So everything's good. I have not been there since the fire, but this was a frequent occurrence with medieval era churches because the roofs were wood. So it's a commonplace thing to happen. In fact, one of the cathedrals, I can't remember, but it's a cathedral in one of the provincial cities recently also had a fire that they think was set purposefully, but the roof burned. And then there's been the controversy of whether or not to redesign it with contemporary windows, but the preservationist movement is so strong there. The heritage of this place is so solidly ingrained in the French imagination as well as the tourist imagination. I don't think they're going to make anything contemporary in the rebuilding.
Sheila?
Muted. Okay. You brought back wonderful, wonderful memories. It was a fabulous lecture. Thank you. And I actually saw a small wedding at the cathedral. It was exquisite, just exquisite. And you left out two of my other favorite sites were the Paris Metro, the sites that are so beautiful on the outside, and the Montmartre. Well, I did a few paintings like every tourist, but every part of Paris was so charming. We went back a few times, and sure, I'd love to go again, but I'm not so sure I could go. I would love you to be my host. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Yeah, the Church of Montmartre is the Montmartre, yeah, which again, many artists lived there, especially at the beginning of the 20th century. And the church is a product of the late 19th century, early 20th century. And I'm sorry I didn't show the metro stations there, the product of the 1900 Art Nouveau design. They were, now the underground, the metro was built for the International World's Fair held in Paris in 1900. And that's when they opened the underground metro. And the metro stations that were designed at that time are the Art Nouveau designs that were contemporaneous with that moment, right?
I love that period. Loved it. Yeah, thank you.
And do you notice my cafe setting?
Yes.
I did.
What's for lunch?
Baguette, a baguette.
Georgia, did you have a question?
Not a question, just some comment, a little bragging rights. Paris is one of my favorite places in the whole world, and I've been in many places, but I really appreciate your talk. But I had a very good friend who used to work with me. She lives in Paris with her family, and I had done a number of business trips in Paris, and also I stayed at her place on a number of occasions in one of the maid's rooms of those little attic rooms. She had that set up as a little guest room for her friends who came to visit. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
Where do you remember what district or arrondissement?
Well, I've been all over, but
where she stayed?
She was not in one of the bed. I don't know. I don't remember. I think it was like the 9th or something like that.
Okay. And
she now lives in the 18th, and opposite. I think it's not the 18th. It's opposite the cemetery, Chez Le Père Cemetery.
Yeah.
In that area.
Père Lachaise. Yeah. Great. Wonderful.
Mary, one last question from Mary.
Yes, it was a wonderful, wonderful travelogue. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And it made me realize something. I grew up in Budapest, and Budapest has been called in Europe Little Paris. And I always thought it was because of the nightlife. And listening to you, I realized it's the architecture. The architecture of the city of Budapest is very similar to Paris. We have very wide boulevards. The buildings are very similar, and then and the Danube runs in the middle of the city. So probably that's the reason why it's been called Little Paris. But I just want to tell something very funny that very shortly. You mentioned that when you speak to Parisians, you should say, excusez-moi, be polite, use the lingo of Paris. Well, I only was in Paris for one day. And my husband and I, we wanted to go to the Boulevard Saint-Germain, and somehow we got lost. So I have about 20 words of French. So I approached the woman, and I did start, excusez, madame, excusez-moi, qu'est-ce que c'est Boulevard Saint-Germain, of which she answered me very rapid French, which I couldn't understand one word. So then I had to tell her, non parle français. But it's funny that you mentioned excusez-moi, which is something that should be used, and I did use it. I'm very proud of myself.
Well, I want to thank you, because I've been to Budapest, and I agree with you. It's beautiful. It looks like Paris, but it has its own character. And you probably knew the lingo and the decorum because you are European. And I think Americans, we're so abrupt in our manners. I always have to give my students a kind of little like, okay, this is how, you enter a store, and, because they aren't aware. I mean, it's just our, and if you watch on Netflix, Emily in Paris, it's really silly, but it's a really good contrast study of the different cultures. It's lighthearted, but it's really true to form of the cultural contrast. Thank you, Mary.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. It
Thank
was
you.
really wonderful.
Thank you for staying and sticking with me.
Thank you so much. And we might have the first ILIR tour to Paris. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Next year in Paris.
Yes. Next year.
Like this.
Carol, I'll stay on for a second.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ciao. Au revoir. Bonne journée.
See, they don't want to leave.
So
I did record it. I'm not sure.